Hello friends, my name is Vanines, and today I'll be discussing Lightlark and Alex Aster. If you want to get to the portion of this video that is a spoiler review of the book, you can jump ahead, but I wanted to start off talking a little bit about the discourse surrounding Aster and this book because I was participating in it over on TikTok. Part of what I do over on TikTok is sort of like rundown videos in which I recap discourse that is happening in the community and then give my 2 cents on it. And so I came across a video that was basically text only saying that Alex Aster is an industry plant, and basically the video was like, I can't wait until people figure out that this is true. So that sent me down a rabbit hole, and there were a handful of other videos on TikTok that were saying the same thing, that Alex Aster was an industry plant. I wanted to dig a little deeper and get to the bottom of why people were saying this and why now, what triggered the conversation about Aster being an industry plant. I did pin some of the information to a Forbes article about her twin sister. Her twin sister is a multimillionaire, and from there, if you search the sisters, you get more information about their situation. So after I went down that rabbit hole and kind of better understood what people were getting at with this industry plant stuff, I made a video that was kind of saying that the real thing here was privilege within publishing and what makes it possible to be able to pursue your art and pursue it sort of doggedly the way that Alex Aster claims that she did. I'm actually going to put the TikTok video here in full so you guys can check it out.
Alex Aster is the author of Lightlark, which is being published at the end of this month, I believe. It is an upper YA new adult fantasy. I believe the main character is 18. The love interests are centuries old, so it's that kind of fantasy. She's got a very large following here on TikTok, over 900,000 followers. And her content more recently has been very focused on her publishing journey, right? She talks a lot about facing a lot of rejection, over 10 years of rejection, working really hard to achieve the success that she has now achieved with a 6-figure deal for this book, and the movie rights having been optioned even before the book has been released. So it's it has almost bootstrappy energy, if you work hard, you too can achieve this, and here's how I got to where I am. But I started to see things that were is Alex Aster an industry plant? Which I just found absolutely fascinating. I tried to get to the bottom of where this was coming from, and I'm not entirely sure, but I think at least some of it can be traced back to an article that was recently published about her twin sister, who is a self-made millionaire worth over $220 million. And you start to see between that and looking into more information about who Alex Aster is, her net worth, her family's net worth, and all of that. This isn't a rags to riches story, right? There was some comfort and support there, which, to be clear, is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't believe in the starving artist or the struggling artist. I wish we could all have the support systems that we needed in order to create and do our art, but that is not the reality. Again, I think it should be. I wish it were. The thing that I take issue with is using a narrative of just work really hard. I worked really hard. If you struggle, you can get here too, without acknowledging privilege, without acknowledging support systems. What made it possible for you to be able to work on a story for 10 years, until you got published, things like that, especially when you are creating an audience or a community around this sort of bootstrappy content, and a community that you will then collect money from to continue to feed your wealth. You sold us something here, and it feels something that was a little bit misleading. And this sort of unacknowledged privilege in publishing, I think, is not Alex Aster's fault. It is a thing within publishing that we don't talk enough about. Who has time, ability, support systems in order to write stories. But I do feel that she has misled her audience in some way, especially because it seems like she's got industry context and connections that isn't just about working hard. Yesterday, I made a video about Alex Aster, which I will link below, and it was in response to what I heard about her being an industry plant, but what I actually wanted to talk about was privilege within publishing spaces and the privilege to create art. some of her supporters were very not happy with me for talking about her unacknowledged privilege and how that fed into what I felt was like misleading marketing, specifically when it comes to like the narratives that she has been spinning about how she got to her success, because I think it is misleading to kind of chalk it all up to determination and, repetition. I kept trying, hard work, which, not to negate those things, I'm sure that was all like present, but you have to acknowledge for support systems and education and the open doors that money kind of exposes you to. Like all of those things are also part of this conversation, and not including it like any narrative of if you just work hard or like merit-based systems. They're a no. We know that that's not true. And then so to sort of have confirmation that that wasn't true in this case either, which we know it is often not, like that's the conversation that I wanted to have. So I did, like I said, get some pushback. People were like, you're canceling her. You're so mean. I did not cancel Alex Aster. I didn't tell anybody not to read her book, not to support her work. I didn't tell anybody, there were no calls to action in my video. I didn't tell anybody to do anything. Therefore, I cannot be canceling her. This community is so bad about hearing any little bit of critique and immediately being like, you're mean, you're immoral, and you're canceling. And none of that happened in my original video. Like, you may not like me or what I was saying, and that's fine. It's still not canceling. There's also this idea of like, is she an industry plant? And first of all, I think that probably people are using the term industry plant in different ways, because like if you Google industry plant, like people will have different definitions for it. And we're taking a term that is generally applied to like the music industry, which is very different than publishing. And what I think people are noticing, or what they're trying to get out anyways, is sort of those open doors, the connections, the privilege that put her starting line way ahead of what people generally get. And so like, whether or not you think that's an industry plant or not, like that's, I think, a separate conversation. And it is very distracting from the thing that is worth talking about. And that is the spaces that we have to create art, and how, much easier it is to create art when your basic needs are met. And that is just true. And that is not Alex Aster's fault, but it is a thing that I think we can talk about without, accusing each other of like, I don't know, being mean or whatever else that people were saying in my comments.
Wow, did I end up getting pushback for that video? I don't know if it was necessarily surprising, or I should say it probably should not have been surprising, but I was taken aback by the amount of pushback that I got and how it sort of spiraled. There were plenty of lovely comments and people supporting me, but the conversation kept growing from there about the whole industry plant stuff. The privilege and publishing aspect of this was never like really addressed or interrogated. People weren't having that conversation. People kept saying it was a conversation worth having, but blowing right past it to get at sort of the other stuff that started happening. So one is that negative reviews of the arc started to crop up. A lot of what we heard initially, and this is the way with marketing plans, was like positive things from the authors blurbing her books and the author friends that Alex Aster has. But then she also has a group of book talk supporters and friends that were also promoting this book and praising it highly. I didn't necessarily like clock the connections she had within book talk, especially because in response to my video, maybe not directly, but you can tell that it was in response to my video because they were using a lot of my speaking points and kind of turning them negatively. There were a number of bigger book talks that were kind of decrying the sort of canceling of Alex Aster, making really bold statements about how this was ruining her career, saying that people were attacking her, tying any of this kind of to her being a Latina woman without at all acknowledging that I too am a Latina woman and Afro-Latina woman. And then this bled over to Goodreads, where people were review bombing the work and one starring it without having read it. That took a lot of the focus away from the conversation in general, and it became this thing of like the internet being mean, people being canceled, you're destroying somebody's career. I was being tagged into comment sections where people were defending Alex Aster. I had people really dedicated to just commenting on all of my videos about this. So it was a wild week for me when all of this was going down. from. The other reason I probably shouldn't have been surprised at this like pushback is because I was talking about privilege, and there is always sort of a knee-jerk defensive reaction whenever you call people out on their privilege. And to be clear, I said multiple times that privilege does not negate hard work, that Alex Aster could have still worked really hard on this book, but acknowledging her privilege is important to the conversation of how she reached success. And people were still like, you know, not listening, not hearing me at all. And for all of the claims that I was destroying somebody's career, Lightlark was #1 on the New York Times bestseller list the week that it debuted. That was kind of like a rough catch up from my perspective of what happened. If you want like a video that is more neutral and with like receipts and stuff, you can check out Rachel's video, which I will link below. And she talks a little more clearly about the timeline and the things that Aster herself was saying on her channel that made it feel like her marketing was being misleading. Aster herself appeared in my comments, which is always like a great and phenomenal thing. And basically she wanted to clarify that she didn't have industry connections that helped her get a book deal or her movie deal. To be clear, she's not a debut author. She has previously published, and she had an agent already, and she had a relationship with, I think, the people who ultimately helped her get the movie deal. So that's kind of what I meant about like, this wasn't somebody like stepping out of her home and being like, can I get a deal? She had previous connections in the industry because she was a previously published author. And so she came into my comments to say, no, she didn't. And then to acknowledge her privileges, which included going to an Ivy League school and graduating without debt, being on her partner's health insurance so that she didn't have to worry about that, and generally being able to write full time because, you know, basic needs were met. Previous to this, the book had not really been on my radar at all. Like I wasn't interested in reading it. All of the marketing around it as well just made it seem like not a thing for me. But all of the discourse then made me really curious to try it for myself, especially because of like the extremes of like 1-star ARC reviews and 5-star friend reviews, and then the review bombing. I was like, okay, well now I really want to see like how this actually is. There was a bunch of hubbub about the ARCs themselves because in like kind of coming after Goodreads for review bombing the work, people were claiming that the ARCs were really exclusive, only 50 ARCs went out, and so there was no way that like hundreds of people had read the book beforehand. I know that it was on NetGalley as an e-ARC for a limited amount of time. I have no idea how many physical ARCs went out, but I do know that they were also giving out audiobook ARCs on NetGalley. And I had multiple people just offer being like, hey, I got an audiobook ARC. Like, do you want to listen to it? Because that is also a thing. People share around ARCs whether or not they are meant to or they should. So that is one thing. But also, this all was happening on the Monday before publication. And like in the thick of things, I was like, well, I want to read it. I don't want to pay for it. So I requested an e-ARC and I got it by that Wednesday. So even leading up to publication, they were still handing out e-ARCs. So all of that noise about the exclusivity of ARCs, I don't know that I totally buy, but yes, I got an ARC in exchange for this super honest review that is about to happen. Went back and forth about whether I would even give it a review because I was overwhelmed by some of the reaction that I got, but also I totally understand, right, that I was involved in this discourse and now I'm giving a review. I was talking to Nicole about it and we both were laughing because the actual like best thing that could have happened was for me to read this book and enjoy it and be like, you know what, it actually is a good book. Even if it were like a 3-star book, that would have been like a really fun twist to this whole story of like, it wasn't a bad book. But unfortunately, I just didn't enjoy it. I didn't enjoy it at all. Lightlark is a young adult fantasy, and in this story, we are following an event called the Centennial. So every 100 years, this island appears, and the 6 rulers of the realms in this world come to this island in order to compete for a chance to break their curses. Each realm has a curse that has been spun on them, and we don't know the origins of the curse, but we do know that the Centennial is their opportunity to try and break that curse. But in order to do so, one of the rulers of the 6 realms must die, and with them, with their death, their entire realm will also die. We follow our main character, Isla Crown, and she is the ruler of the Wildling Kingdom. So this is her first Centennial, and she's competing to try and save her kingdom from ruin because she was born powerless, and with her lack of power, her kingdom is failing. So she's playing for the opportunity to save her kingdom and of course break her curse. I think I was expecting bad from this because of those like early 1-star reviews, and I do understand a lot of those 1-star reviews. I myself am kind of in that 1-star range, 1 to 1.5 star. I will say this is not the worst thing that I have ever read, and I think that some of the commentary on the writing itself is a little bit exaggerated. It's not good, but it is a clean manuscript, whereas some of the worst things I have ever read are just like badly written and badly edited, and I just don't feel like that is the case here. There are moments where the writing does feel bad or clunky or wordy or descriptions aren't great, but the bulk of this writing is just fine. It is very plain. It is almost a little lifeless. It is serviceable. So like that's sort of the range that we are looking at. So the very extreme reaction to this writing is like the worst thing that people have ever read. I think is a little much to me personally. I think a big issue here, and it ties into the writing itself, is just like a tone thing. I hate to use this word because I know that people sometimes mean it as an insult, but the writing to me did feel young. It felt a little like juvenile. It felt a lot like reading a middle grade book. And to be clear, that is not what's wrong with this book. Like, middle grade is one of my favorite categories. Some of my favorite books of all time are middle grade. But I think what happens is because it reads middle grade, but it's supposed to be sort of in this YA category, and it plays a lot with like tropes of the YA category, but it also has like adult romance things that it's trying to do. All of these things clash and they create such a tonal dissonance in the story. So you have a YA book that is trying for the sexiness of an adult like fantasy romance, but also has like almost the world building elements and sort of the vocabulary of a middle grade. There was almost no world building here. I felt completely just dropped into these circumstances, and we are told a lot of things, but we are never really shown or explained things. I never got a grasp in the world. I have no concept of like the map of the world or the look of the world or even like the internal logic of the world. I absolutely do not understand why things were happening the way that they happened, and I don't understand sort of like the rules and parameters of the world as the author set them up. I was constantly asking myself why, and I don't feel like the story gave us a good enough why to justify anything that was happening, and it became distracting, and I found myself incapable of investing in anything because it all felt ridiculous. It felt ridiculous that we had this like setup of a fight to the death basically for the breaking of these curses, but then as we get there are all of these like challenges that are set up so the rulers of the realms could like display their power, but why? Especially because none of that felt like it had any impact, or the story didn't go far enough to really explain the impact of that or like why they were dropped here. And all of these like big displays of powers would happen over 1 or 2 pages and then we would just move on. So nothing had the weight or the stakes that it felt were required of a sort of fight to the death for the lives of thousands of people, which was what this ultimately was trying to set up. There was a lot of lack of imagination to me in terms of the way that the world was constructed and built, even so far as like the naming conventions of everything. So our main character is the ruler of the Wildling Kingdom, and her name is Isla Crown, and the rest of the kingdoms are like the Moonling and the Starling and the Sunling Kingdom. The Starlings live on Star Isle and the Skylings live on Sky Isle. So everything was so simply named that it became really repetitive and difficult to keep track of everything. This is an example of the kind of thing that is just thrown out at you and that I would just like let wash over me without absorbing anything. It was the 15th day of the centennial. Isla was anxious to search the next library for the Bondbreaker as soon as possible. It hadn't been on Star Isle, but perhaps they would get lucky and it would be in the Sky Isle collection. If not, she would have to wait until the full moon to go to the Moon Isle, and she still hadn't come up with a plan to get on to Sun Isle unnoticed. Everything is color-coded. The ruler of the like golden people, his name is Oro. The ruler of the Sky Isle people, his name is Azul. The broody bad boy who's the ruler of like the Nightshade people or whatever, his name is Grim. And so it's just this like simplicity and like world building that was sort of grating to me personally, to my taste. But the thing that made it like just generally not good is that you take that super simplistic base and she built a very convoluted plot on top of it. The way that this thing kind of unraveled, I mean, I said that this was going to be a spoil-filled review, but I don't actually know how to explain the way that this plot went on. And the fact that it felt overly simplistic and convoluted at the same time is almost impressive to me. And it felt like a series of events that weren't well connected, that weren't like seamless or graceful in the way that it was telling a cohesive story. It created a pace for the book that I didn't find enjoyable. So the beginning was too fast. We start the book and almost immediately, like within a few pages, we're on the island for the centennial. Feels like the equivalent of, like, if we're going to compare this to the Hunger Games, like starting Katniss like at the Hunger Games, like at the cornucopia, right? With no like seeing her in District 12 and seeing her prepare for the actual games and watching that whole like thing that she goes to before she even steps foot in the game. And when she gets to the game, you're fully invested in Katniss as a character. You understand the stakes of what she is fighting for. You don't expect her to win. She's an underdog. Like all of that stuff is very present in the story, and it makes the actual Hunger Games like just so full of feeling. Here, we're just like, hey, this is Isla. She can fight with pointy things. All right, time for the games. And I was like, okay, like, why am I supposed to care? And then the middle drags on through this series of events. Like I said, these series of failures that felt like bummer after bummer. I think when you're in a plot where it's mostly watching a character struggle, you need some wins to balance out the losses. If you're only losing all of the time, that creates like a very monotonous sort of plot, a very downer experience. Again, I didn't know why I was supposed to care or be interested, especially because not only was she failing, but the main character is like reckless. She's making bad decisions. She's not ever coming to the right conclusion. She's looking at things and just seeing them like for what they aren't. And so it's like this repeated sequence of events that is just like fail, fail, stupid things. I wasn't having a good time. And then when we get to the end, I don't know if things speed up necessarily. It felt sped up because it was like plot twist after plot twist. It was a series of betrayals basically that happened at the end. You're like, oh no, this person betrayed her. Psych, he didn't. He just was doing something else. But this person betrayed her. And then it's like, well, not really. Like here were his reasons, but this person for real betrayed her. And that was true. That person for real betrayed her. And then she like escapes briefly only to find out that 2 more people in fact betrayed her. And I was like, what is none of this is having an impact, because at this point I've like just digested 6 betrayals. So you've done it so many times that nothing matters. But also like it didn't really matter because I never got to know the characters. All of the characterization was incredibly flat. It felt to me like all of these people were interchangeable. I couldn't tell you anything about their personality. The most that I could tell you is about like their trope and their color coding according to their realm. But like seriously, if you switched any character with anyone else, it would be exactly the same. There was nothing here that felt like a deep character-driven story or deep characterization. So by the time it was like, this person betrayed her, I was like, okay, sure, because I don't know anything about this character, so I believe that that is true, that they were betraying her all along. I honestly was just like rolling my eyes at the end. It became very comical the way that it was like pulling out all the stops, but it had no foundation to pull from. I kind of already given my impressions of the main character. She was very flat. I didn't enjoy following her because of the way that she wasn't observant. She was typecast in sort of the virginal, naive main character type from like romanticies, especially the kind where the love interests are centuries old men and the like young girl, virginal girl who has never talked to a man ever is like the romantic lead. Everything is in that mold, and I just don't usually find that enjoyable, and I didn't here, especially like I said, because she was just doing such rash things. And then even the book knew it. Like she would do these like wild things that would explode in her face, and then she was like, I wasn't thinking, which again, not enjoyable for me. The thing that I found most grating about this character, however, is that she is a not like other girls character, because the author talked about how the main character was inspired by her own experiences as a Latina and Indigenous woman. You kind of understand that like that influence is in the main character and the wildlings, right? They are coded as the sort of Latina realm in all of this. At the very least, these are the people that the Latina inspired main character come from. So there is that very clear connection of like inspiration here. And I think that that was poorly handled, honestly. The whole thing with the wildlings, again, let this register that the Latina inspired realm are called the wildlings. Their whole thing is that they're very sexy and they're very siren-like in that they can intoxicate and lure people and make them fall in love with them, and they feed off of human hearts. So the typecasting around the Latina stand-ins are that they are beastly, they are wild, they are sexy, they are seductresses, and that they eat human hearts. And there's a portion of this that I was trying to give the benefit of the doubt because there is at least a little bit of lip service of like, well, maybe that's not entirely true. That's how everybody else sees them. That's how they are kind of cursed to be because of the curses on the realms. But the more we go through the story, and by the time we get to the end, the more it feels to me like that typecasting is confirmed. And what we actually get is that Isla isn't like them, right? She doesn't have the same curse as them. She isn't a seductress. She doesn't eat hearts. So all of those other Latina characters are actually those stereotypes, which are common stereotypes that are used against Latina people in media, but not her. She's not like other girls. We see this emphasized in the fact that all of the other female characters in the story are either evil or betray her. There's one character who ends up not being a betrayer. She is a servant character who is a side character and really insignificant to the plot. But for the entire book, we actually think that she is sort of a spy or betraying the main character. So even if at the end there's a line that's like, oh, she wasn't. We thought she was the entire time. And then every other female main character that we are introduced to is indeed either a betrayer or evil. And so the only good female character is our not like other girls female main character. There is one other BIPOC character, and it is Azul. He is also gay, and he feels very tokenized in the story itself. The story introduces him, and we get a little bit about his background, like we get the background of the other rulers, but I think he's only like on page 1 or 2 times, and every other time that he's referenced, it's off screen. He is very inactive in the story. He's very tossed aside by the story, at least to my feelings and the way that I read it. It made me incredibly uncomfortable. One of the core pieces of the story here is in fact the romance, and it is a love triangle between Isla and then Grimm, who is like the shadowy bad boy that everybody is scared of, and he has shadow magic and he's super powerful, and she is attracted to him and she doesn't know why. And then we have Oro, who is like the big king on top of everybody. He's the golden boy. He's light to Grimm's dark. So that's sort of the setup here. And honestly, as you can probably guess by hearing me talk about like how flat all of the characters were, the romance didn't also work for me because I don't understand why anybody liked anybody. If you have flat characters in a romance, obviously the romance is not going to work because there's no chemistry between any of them. It really felt like we were hitting trope beats, but it had none of the backing of like actually understanding why these people were attracted to each other. And it kind of made a little bit more sense for Grimm and Isla at the end because you find out that they are connected more than we previously thought, and it's a whole plot twist that also means that Isla isn't as like naive and virginal as we thought, but she plays that way anyway. That's the role that she takes on throughout the majority of her story. But the thing is that we're also supposed to believe that Oro is falling in love with Isla, and that is reciprocated by the end. We get to the big climax and there's all of these big feelings about falling in love and transference of power because of the strength of their love. And I was like, in what book? Because I didn't get any of that from this book. It really was all just telling us and showing us absolutely nothing. Really what it felt like was that this wasn't a character-driven book. It wasn't a plot-driven book. It wasn't a setting-driven book. This was a trope-driven book. It felt like we were just really interested in hitting specific character and plot tropes, and we were getting there by any means necessary. I was really going back and forth about my rating here because, again, this isn't the worst thing I've ever read. So I was like, okay, 1.5 star book, but my ratings are both quality and enjoyment. Like, I take my enjoyment of the story into account. So considering the fact that like I would put it at maybe like a 1.5 star book, but I didn't enjoy any portion of reading this, that really bumps it down to 1 star for me. I can't say that I would recommend it, but if you were still curious to try it for yourself, which I totally get the impulse because that's what I did, it is at least readable. Like, there isn't a lot of friction here because of that simplicity and sort of sameness of the language. It means that you can just sort of binge it. Like, I didn't binge it. I didn't read it quickly because I kept getting so bored and frustrated that I put it down. But if you can like disengage your brain to the level that it requires, you can definitely read this very quickly. And that's the best thing I have to say about that. That's it for me today. If you have read or would like to read Lightlark by Alex Aster, let's chat about it down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. One of the things that I've seen repeated in like negative reviews is the description of the sun as a yolky thing, like a yolky thing, which I agree is like not a very effective sort of description. Like if you say the sun looked like a yolk, I think that is probably better than yolky thing. But the thing is that we hear it twice in the book. And first time is the character saying it was a yolky thing about the sun. And then later she sees like an actual egg yolk and she's like, isn't that what I've always said, that the sun looks yolky? And so it's like a callback to a description she did previously. What I will say about this is that it could have worked as a sort of like fun and funny description that is more in the character's voice, right? Like it's not supposed to be a poetic description. It is supposed to be a description from the character's voice where she's like, yeah, the sun looks yolky. And that could be something that is really indicative of our character and our character's voice. But the problem is that we have no sense of her and we have no sense of her personality. So we get this like yolky line and it's like the one flash of her personality. And so I absolutely get why people are like, take it back. There are stories that I can think of that have a really strong narrative voice, a really strong sense of the character, where if they had said the sun looks like a yolky thing, I would have been like, cute. It didn't work here.